research and humanities. And so I recently published a book. It's out now. You can buy it. I'll show you a link in a moment. And it talks about geo-AI as a new area of investigation that, well, when I say new perhaps for humanities, geo-AI, spatially explicit AI, it's been around for a while, but it's being newly energized by powerful algorithms and private sector data repositories that are fueling this. But we're not quite at the same spot as we are with language models. So, and I'm going to dive into this territory from the side with a field project that tried to do some geo-AI supported land cover analysis. I'm going to give you that story and then back out and say how this fits into the larger landscape of current AI inquiry and why I think students from computer science should come to me and work with me. Anyway, so operational artifacts, what does this mean here? Planetary computing, these are terms that are used now in the humanities to try to come to terms with the convulsions of computing systems that are falling out into the everyday. And one of the interesting discussions going on is how artifacts can be read properly. So satellite data is a complex configuration, perhaps you're experts in this, multidimensional constructs, and they have spatial data and the metadata is a complex operation. When you just look at an image, you don't actually see what makes the artifact really significant. And in the same way, archaeologists, for example, look at rocks and they try to find ways how they can interpret the significance of an artifact beyond its visual appearance. And so there's an interesting kind of like shared space or interest in these questions. So enough kind of like abstraction. Here's this project I worked with Planet Labs, a startup company, a few years ago, startup company in the US that has launched hundreds of small CubeSats into orbit, and they now image the entire planet every 24 hours, right? And they have a very interesting sensor suite on board that recently, since 2022, allows for new inquiries into vegetation indices. So vegetation is a complex configuration, and we have actually established methods in geospatial operations, how people look at vegetation through Landsat imagery and Sentinel imagery. I'm not going to talk about military assets here. And this private sector endeavor added several new bands that are very, very powerful for looking at forestry. And in particular, it turned out that the tropical forestry with the rich greens and the kind of like lush density just kind of like really popped out very well while looking at these this space here in central Indonesia on the island of Bali. And so I had the opportunity to work with Planet Labs and to do some imaging. And so we started by looking simply at, where are the untouched forests? An early question. How have the settlements changed over the years? And we put together, I have to point here, I think, a body of work in this realm. So here's kind of like the complete map of central Bali. There's Bali, complete map. And we were interested in the highlands. And the highlands are important because there's a land dispute going on between the indigenous people of Tamlingan and the central government of who's taking care of the land, who's the best caretaker of the land. And so how do you prove if a group is taking care of the land? You look at the land use that is established and the land kind of like care practices that exist historically. But how do you document that? And so we agreed we worked to an NGO, a local NGO that interfaced between my research group and the Tamlingan to decide on mapping out agroforestry. So agroforestry is a kind of like form of tropical land cover, but at the same time, outside of a kind of like a GIS perspective. It's a very interesting form of land use and kind of like way of life. So this is not a monoculture working of the land, but rather you can imagine them as three-dimensional gardens. So they're trees, they're shrubs, they're small plants, and they're arranged in different plots, usually small. These are not large-scale operations. Small families and groups of workers tend to these plots, and they're very irregular. And so if you look at these plots through satellite imagery, it's very hard to find. And so I give you here 3 examples of what agroforestry looks like. And they kind of like differentiate themselves with the species, but also with the arrangement. Some of them are loosely arranged. They look like kind of like a forest, and others are more geometrically arranged, depending on what type of activities are planned. And what's interesting about the agroforestry setup from a small farm perspective is that you always have something to eat. There's always something. Of course, it's a tropics, so there's a quick cycle of blooming and harvest, but because you have so many different species, there's always something you can grab or sell at the market. So it's a resilient form of land use, and it's also interesting from a climate change perspective because it's more resilient to change in temperature and in rainfall. So the root system of these varied plants goes down not just to one fixed level if you have one species, but kind of like further. There's some at the tops, from the middle, some further down. So it keeps the water in the soil. And that is important because these areas that we looked at are in the highlands of Bali, so up to 2,000 meters, very steep hills. And if you don't have these kind of configurations, basically you have runoff and soil erosion. So agroforestry is an important way of dealing with the confines of the tropics, the highland tropics, and it's been used by the Tamlingan for centuries. And so by monitoring and observing and documenting the extent of agroforestry, we're making a contribution to helping the Tamlingan document their, how should I say, careful use of the land. So that's kind of like the context. Okay, so how do you go and do this? This way. So it turns out that, so we were working with Planet Labs over a number of years, and when we started, they had a superdove configuration, had only 4 bands, and we tried to do kind of all kinds of different land cover configurations, and the 4 bands that they had, even though it was rapidly updated and wonderfully luscious spatial resolution of 3 meters per pixel. Sentinel, European kind of like standard, has between 10 and 60 meters per pixel. So Planet Labs is very generous in this regard. But the 4 bands that we had at our disposal were not able to capture agroforestry. And they were also hardly able to do a good job on rice paddies. And so in 2022, they launched a new generation of these satellites with 4 additional bands in the realm where vegetation is kind of like has its signatures. And so all of a sudden we were starting to get some kind of like signature that we felt we could actually work with. And this was just a casual observation first. Then in order to get data in the field, we had to work with local informants to find agroforestry sites. And one of the problems that we had is that it looks like a lot of other things. So it overlaps not only from its spectral signature, but also from its use scenarios with mixed gardens, rice paddies not so much, but mixed forests, all these kind of, it's just a massive green, right? So how do you get good data if this is kind of like your pot to choose from, right? And so we started off, for example, with just looking at satellite imagery that we would download and study, right? And then we engaged experts, Balinese experts who look at the canopy structure from the Indonesian Institute of Sciences. And then in the next step, we went actually, and I had several visits to Bali to speak with representatives of the Tamlingan. This is one group of young folks, Rasti, who interact with kind of like the NGOs and the tourists or what, to share their experiences of living in Bali. Bali is a famous place you might know for the rice terraces, and you've got the tourists that go to the beaches, and so they're quite aware of their interest in their lands. And I met with the Brasti group to find people who would help me identify agroforestry plots. Because if you have no domain knowledge, you will not be able to put together good data. Right? So good data actually requires real fundamental knowledge. You can't just go grab that somewhere. And this is fundamentally different when you do text AI, right? And we can all get a text corpus somewhere. But if you're dealing with this type of data, the access to gold data, important data, is much more challenging. And so we put together a list, iterative list of places we wanted to visit. Some of them, obviously, here in the water. This is just like from the satellite imagery itself, but most of the other places were actually visited, either with informants, went there with a video, took the video, GPS marking, and then we studied the data that they sent us, or in some cases, I did some of these data collection points myself. So no domain knowledge, no data, no AI. And then we took our data that was collected and refined over almost a year, growing in size and kind of like filtering out, throwing things that seemed to not make sense out. And we asked ourselves, what's the best algorithm to use to do a segmentation-based image and a landscape analysis, a land cover analysis of these areas? And so we tried random forest, support vector machine, shallow neural nets, larger nets, U-nets, and then in the end also residual nets that were pre-trained. And this went over a year working with some students here in this program, in fact, and to see like what configuration is going to give us good coverage across all the categories, and then particularly agroforestry. And so it turns out agroforestry is really hard to do. It's just hard for some of the reasons I mentioned before. It's hard because the spectral signature is complex. It's hard because the plots are small. It's hard because it's randomly distributed. It's not like you have like this big square of cornfields and you can say, wow, here's corn. So random forest, F1, terrible, can't use it. Support vector machine, pretty good. UNet, much better, but the problem with our UNet model was it was too big. And so we think part of the reason that was so good is basically just overfit, right? And so we couldn't get a small enough UNet model that worked with our comparatively small data set. So it was back and forth, which is the best way. And we presented this work in several geospatial conferences because the problem is significant. Like, how much data do you need to couple with which particular algorithm such that you get a really good result, right? When you don't have endless data. And in fact, in this context, you also don't have endless compute, which I'll get to in a moment. And so here, kind of like the visualization of those outputs. On the left, random forest, in the middle, support vector machine, and on the right, UNet, with the categories of interest to us. We did not just want to isolate agroforestry. We wanted to see how it works with all the other land cover categories of interest to the Tomlingon and also of interest to the Indonesian government. So part of the project consisted in not just going off and saying, oh, let's find what we can do, but rather, how is the government working this problem? We want to give the indigenous group a literally map of their lands that is good enough such that it would be recognized as valid by government agencies. And that's why we had to include land cover categories that we were not necessarily prominently interested in, but in order to kind of like check also, like, are we overestimating our agroforestry plots? So that's why this all comes together. One of the problems that made the project really interesting, and I think almost material for inquiry beyond the technologies we put together, is the question of reading the landscape, right? And so it turns out there's interesting or strange configurations. Here's an example of agroforestry, identified as such by our experts in a satellite imagery of the proper resolution. And then we went to visit it just to make sure. And so it turns out that this is a hotel garden. So what happens in Bali is that the bucolic landscape of the rice paddies and the agroforestry plots is being selectively imitated for tourist travel. So you have, and specifically in the very high-end tourist sites, the large landscape areas, and these types of land use that in the past were bucolic forms of working the land, working the rice paddies, working agroforestry, are being misused, if you so want, as backdrops for tourist visits. And so it was just interesting. We were not able to take an estimate how much agroforestry is fake agroforestry, but it made us think about kind of like the space that we're in. So we have algorithms that are quite good at getting us a notion of how much agroforestry is, but we have like fake data or noise, as I think we might say in computer science. And so what do we do if that in fact is the given? And we don't have our tools are limited, or more limited than we want, but they still show us a significant kind of like new form of documenting something that was previously undocumented. And so what we decided to do is do these kind of like maps that include a visual notion of uncertainty. So we came up with like projecting our findings, thresholded, like I think we use the SVM here in this particular context, onto an infrared image to give specifically the locals a notion of where have these like plots been detected, right? So that we can say, as we move forward and perhaps in the future get much more better data, because the satellites will get better yet, and perhaps there is an algorithm that's going to do even a better job. We don't know. But so we want to like work with the fact that we have more unknowns than we're perhaps comfortable with. Okay, so that's kind of like the data analysis project. And I want to talk about doing a project like that in an emerging economy, or as a term is now more properly formulated, the majority world. And so like doing geo AI or AI in general in contexts where you have limited resources. So in general, we think about the AI landscape, if I may make a generalization here. The data, there's models, and then we have compute infrastructures. And in order to get the best results, we want the largest data sets, the largest models, and the most powerful compute. So more is better. However, if you work in contexts where there are limitations, and so we had multiple different kinds of limitations. It was hard to get good data, as I mentioned before. Going to some of these sites required treks through the forest, multiple hours of walking to verify if the sites were okay. We realized that because of our limited data, that just growing models was not necessarily the best way to go. And we also realized that if we're going to work with our partners in Indonesia, that we have to have some system that is going to work also on a laptop, literally. So how are we going to do that? So different ideas. Okay, well, let's just, because we did a lot of the training on Azure systems that are wonderful, great, train anything you want. But so how are they going to log in? And then the internet connections are shaky. And it was just all kinds of barriers that you don't expect. And so what we end up doing is we kind of like a distributed notion. We would do some of the more complex things here with the team that has resources, and then we'd use open source utilities, for example, QGIS, or you can do a downstripped version of random forest, kind of like on smaller areas. And then we would have discussions where we would bring all this together to try to make sense of not only the data and what the algorithms are telling us, but the context in which this operation works. So if you're going to work in contexts that do not have endless resources, you have to adapt how you're going to do your analytics if you want to serve a particular stakeholder group. And so agency matters. I'll show you in a moment just how and why, and capacity. So not only capacity in the technical sense that do they have storage space, or do they have a fast internet connection, but the capacity of the group to deal with the technical terrain. How do you do that? What we did in our case, we had like workshops where we would describe how these algorithms work and say, you know, like this is how we want to do it, and you know, part of it was then, you know, like tutorials and things like that. But the idea was like, how do you bring in the groups you're working with in a way that they will contribute to the project and gain from it? So as I mentioned before, we did combinations of approaches that mutually enforced each other in a way to respond to resource constraints, a mixed methods approach. So local agency, small data sets, low computational complexity, local agency, small data sets, and higher computational complexity if they would work on our distributed models, and then computational complexity, scalable models, larger data sets. You take that away from 2 more minutes. Yeah. Okay. Is someone else coming in? No. Yeah. And then, of course, at the end, you want to take the absolute largest that you can get, canonical data sets, perhaps, and pre-trained foundation models. Okay, so just a moment. Like, if you have smaller models, you can respond to some anomalies that models will produce. So well, here's one, Lake Tumblingon. Does not have rice paddies, as we have here. And with some additional well-chosen data points, we can address those anomalies. And that matters because that's a holy lake, and no, there can be no economic activity there. The UNet was a wonderful contribution, but its preparation and design was too complicated for our case, even though the results were interesting. And then we worked with very large pre-trained ResNet models offered by the AI Allen Institute. And so they come pre-trained, which is wonderful. However, they work with Sentinel data, so they don't have the spatial resolution that we were interested in. And they work very well for showing, for example, the distribution of roads and built-up areas. However, when we went to the fine-grained forest cover, they failed. They're not trained for that. And they don't have the spatial resolution that would be appropriate for our agroforestry plots. Another big problem with the pre-trained models is that the categories they include are not those that we're interested in. So this is not SATLAS, but a different project called SAT-MA. I think it came out of Stanford. And they worked with the functional map of the world. And if you just go through these categories here, you realize that if you're doing fringe landscape inquiries, then airports, airport hangars, airport terminals is not going to help you very much. And so getting things off the shelf that are kind of like prepared is great if it is built with your use case in mind. And otherwise, you have to build it yourself. So I'm almost finished here. The idea that small models can be selectively more helpful than large models is not something that's limited to this particular case study, but is being looked at, for example, in language models, where the largest models are 2 terabyte trained on 40 terabytes of tokens for Claude 3 Opus. There's a project out, Baby LM, that has only 3.8 billion parameters, large number, but much smaller compared to the state of the art. And the idea is that for language models, if you actually want to emulate human language, that you don't need these terabyte size models. And so the only reason I'm bringing this up is that this idea that bigger is better is being questioned not only by small projects as my own, but by much larger endeavors, because the reason is that it's more expensive to train, more expensive to do inference, to host, and the complexity grows and grows. Anyway, so here, there's a book out that tells the whole story, AI and geography in the Alas Mertajti. And down at the bottom, if you can scan that in, there's an installation, a website that allows you to play with those algorithms that I showed. So random forest, SVM, k-means, ResNet on some of the landscapes that we looked at, so that you can see how the choice of the analyst impacts the analysis. And I have the training data there, the videos of where we went, and describe the whole story as kind of like a parallel to the book itself. And that is the end of this project. Thank you very much.
So we'll just take one question, just to apologies for the late start and the technical snaffles.
When you talked about the overfitting potential with the neural net, I've done something in a large language model for race and ethnicity identification, and one of the things that I found was that I was using neural net with concern about it being, 60 million parameters. But then when I calculated the solution space of first name, last name, address, gender, then suddenly the potential solution space was measured in the hundreds of billions.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't feel bad about using a 50 million parameter model on something that had a potential. Now, the actual space is much smaller, but the potential space is quite large. So the question I would ask is, like, how big is your potential space for the permutations of what you're predicting with the net?
Potential space. I don't know. I'd have to look. I'd have to dig into that. I don't have that ready, that answer.
I wanted to ask, I might have missed it in the beginning of the talk. What is the data set size? Is it the same across UNet, ResNet
Yes.
models? Or?
Yes, we use so we use the same map, but then from the map, so the way geospatial data is, you basically designate areas. For example, this one is a rice paddy, right? And then you sample from this area, right? And so the density of the sampling defines then the data set size. So we varied that sampling a little bit. Random forest much less, SVM, but for the UNet we kind of did a denser sampling, but it's the same area effectively. Yeah.
I see. But in terms of the sample count?
Similar. So we simply said, this is the data that we have, which is the best algorithm to work with it. That's the idea. Yeah.
I see.
Because you can't just make more. You have to start to do data augmentation, all kinds of funny things. But that there's it's fakery if you want. If you say, I want the gold data, right? So machine learning, we have this. There's data that you get by, rotating an image and but then there's the gold data of the actual images with the proper labels that you use fundamentally, right? That all data is not equal, right? So we try to keep the data set as constant as we could. Yeah. Right.
Let's thank Marc for a wonderful talk. Small token of appreciation.
Thank you.
So we will quickly proceed to the next talk, which is presented by Nan Xi from our department, working with Professor Jun Song-Yeon. And what I will do, Nan, is that I might use my speaker in my laptop and place the microphone near that, because can you just say something and we'll see if it works?
Hi, Ranga.
It's not.
Yeah.
Let me.
Okay, great. So hi, everyone. It seems there's some echo from my computer. You can hear me now? Okay, I think it works. Okay, yeah, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Nan Xi. I'm a final year PhD student from the CSE department of UB. So today I would like to share our recent work on ACCV 2024. So this work is done by with my wonderful collaborator Yisong Wang from Peking University, and also my advisors, Professor Men and Professor Yuan. So in this work, we are focusing on the topic of interaction-centric spatial-temporal context reasoning for multi-person video HUI recognition. Yeah, so in this task, work, we are focusing on the task of so-called multi-person video human object interaction recognition. So basically, that means if we are given a specific video, we are required to recognize what is interaction class that are happening between the human and object in the video. So for example, in these slides, we are showing that three kinds of video human object interaction recognition classes in the multi-person scenarios, like the co-working, cheering, and haircutting. Yeah, so for this specific task, there are two major challenges. The first one is that we know that human-object interaction includes three aspects, including human objects and the interaction class that are happening between the human and objects. And so these three aspects of HUI exhibit interconnectedness, and they have mutual influence upon each other. So that's the first challenge of this multi-person video HUI recognition task. And the second one is that since there are multi-person and multi-objects in the video, so the combination of these multi-person and multi-objects have very complex spatial-temporal interaction relationships. So in order to solve this video human object, multi-person human object interaction recognition task, we have to deal with these two challenges. And to address these two challenges that I mentioned above, we propose this interaction-centric hypersphere. So basically, this interaction-centric hypersphere is based on the assumption that human object entities that belongs to a specific interaction class should be localized on the surface of the hypersphere that is taking control of the interaction class. So for example, in this figure, we can see that the interaction class localized in the center of the hypersphere. And this interaction class takes control a specific hypersphere. And if a human object entity belongs to this specific interaction class, we assume that this human object entity should localize at the surface of this hypersphere. So that's the most important assumption and a motivation that we design framework in this work. And based on this interaction-centric hypersphere, we can learn the human object interaction manifold structure that showing the underlying structure priors of human object and interaction in this specific task. And that means we can model the interdependencies among predicted human objects and interactions. And also, we can encode both the entity and the interaction representation of human objects with reasoning abilities about the interaction state transitions across video. So this is the motivations that we have to design our model to solve this multi-person video human object interaction recognition task. So for the specific architecture of this hypersphere model, if we are given a specific video clip, for each video frame, we first take the frame feature from a backbone model, and then we design a context fusor model and the interaction state reasoning model, which I will introduce later, to learn a good representation for both the human and object and we call it human object entity representation. And with that learned human object entity representation, we utilize a bidirectional GRU to model the temporal dynamics across video frames. And with that, we learn the human object entity representation as well as the interaction class representation. And we can generate the predicted interaction probability of each human object entity that belongs to a specific interaction class. So this is the general architecture of our proposed model. And specifically for the context filter module, we can, the design context filter module can deal with both multi-person and single-person scenarios. So that means our design model is very versatile and flexible. So for example, in the multi-person cases, we first design a object filter block that integrates both the object information to learn the total object information in the video frame, and with that learned object in representation, we use an interaction filter block to incorporate the interaction class into the human representation and object representation. And with that, we further design a human filter block with a self-attention and cross-attention to learn the final human representation together with the object representation. So that's the architecture for the multi-person scenario. And for the single-person scenario, it's generally the same with the multi-person cases, except that we don't have the the interaction filter block for the human part. So we can easily transfer from the multi-person scenario to the single-person scenario with the design context filter module. Yeah, and another important module in our architecture is this interaction state reasoning module, meaning that we learn the weight omega-1 and omega-2 at each timestamp. So that means the final entity representation of human and object is determined by both the entity representation at this time step and as well as the last time step. So we can take the weighted mean, weighted average of the entity representation at this time step as well as the last time step to determine the final entity representation as the current time step. So that's the context filter block and the interaction state reasoning block that we designed to help us learn good representation of human object entities. And with that, since we have learned the entity representation of human objects as well as the interaction class representation, we designed this interaction-centric hypersphere to help us compute the probability of a human object entity that it should be categorized into the interaction class I. So basically, the UI, this function shows how do we compute the probability of the entity that are categorized into interaction class I, and it basically tells us that we enforce the residual of the we enforce the residual of the interaction class representation and the entity representation to be to take the norm of the residual, and we enforce the norm of the residual to be close to the radius of the hypersphere that is taking control of a specific interaction class. So that means the higher value of this probability indicates that the specific human and object entity is more likely to be categorized into the interaction class I. So that's the objective, the learning objective in our framework, and we optimize this objective to train our model. So the above part are all the approaches that we design in our model. And with this model, we take experiment on several different data sets in multi-person human object, video human object entity representation. And we found that in this MPHY-72 data set, which is the widely used multi-person video HUI recognition data set, our approach surpasses existing total method by more than 20 points in terms of F1 score. And also in another multi-person video HUI data set, which is by many action data set, our this data set is different from this MPHY-72 data set in the case that it only contains one person, but it shows the interaction of two hands of the person. So in this data set, we do not achieve, we do not surpass very much compared with existing solar data sets. And we anticipate that this is because this data set of by many action data set is since it does not contain two persons, and the MPHY-72 data set contains two persons, which is very much helpful for us to learn good representation of human and objects. And we also show some qualitative results of the of our approach on the MPHY-72 and CAD 120 data set. And we can find that if we remove the context filter block, our model could generate some error prediction compared with the full model, indicates that the context filter block is very essential for us to generate accurate prediction of video HUI recognition task. And in order to validate the effectiveness of the interaction-centric hypersphere, we also visualize in both 3D and 2D, and we found that in the 3D domain, we can in 3D space we can find that those small dots of those small red dots and the purple dots are those specific human object entities that respond that belongs to different interaction classes, and we found that those specific human object entities that belongs to different interaction class localizes on the near the surface of the hypersphere that takes in control of a specific interaction class, which aligns with our assumption that if a human object entity belongs to a specific interaction class, it should localize on the surface. Although it's the result does not show the perfect scenario, but it aligns with our assumption. And in the 2D space, we also observe similar result, which the human object entities localizes near the surface of each interaction class that it belongs to. So basically, this visualization result indicates that the interaction-centric hypersphere that we propose is reasonable and effective in dealing with this video human object interaction recognition task in the multi-human scenarios. Yeah, so in summary, in this work, we propose a context filter and interaction state reasoner to learn the spatial-temporal context and as well as the reasonability for entity representations. And we also represent human object identity components with the proposed interaction-centric hypersphere for the HOI classification task. And empirical result indicates that our model surpasses certain methods by a large margin in multi-person scenarios, and in the single-person cases, we can achieve competitive results. Yeah, so that's the end of my talk, and you are welcome to check the paper and code out of this work, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah. Are there any questions?
Your lambda seems to be a constant, right? And it's a hyperparameter. So it's not a. You get my question, Nan?
Yeah. Hello. Hello, can you hear me now? It seems I cannot hear you. Hello.